Hey everybody, this is the preface and the table of contents to The Evolution of Dialectical Materialism, a philosophical and sociological analysis, written by Z.A. Jordan. Okay, so here we go. Here's the table of contents. Part 1, The Philosophical Sources of Dialectical Materialism. Chapter 1, The Origins of Dialectical Materialism. Section 1, The Significance of Anti-During. Section 2, The Prevailing View on the Intellectual Partnership of Marx and Engels. Section 3, Engels' Tradition in the Interpretation of Marx. Section 4, The Naturalism of Marx and the Dialectical Materialism of Engels. Chapter 2, Marxian Naturalism. Section 1, The Sole Reality of Nature. Section 2, The Old and the New Materialism. Section 3, The Anthropological Conception of Nature. Section 4, Sacred and Profane History. Section 5, The Idealist and Materialist Conception of History. Section 6, The Social Origin of Man's Distinctive Characteristics. Section 7, Is Marx a Materialist? Section 8, Marx's Contribution to Naturalism. Chapter 3, The Influence of Hegel's Philosophy. Section 1, The Various Interpretations of the Relation of Marx to Hegel. Section 2, Marx's Attitude towards Hegel. Section 3, Engels' Attitude towards Hegel. 4, Marx's Indebtedness to Hegel. 5, The Hegelian Revival in the Philosophy of Engels. Chapter 5, French Positivism and the Philosophy of Marx and Engels. Section 1, The Evaluation of Saint-Simon and Comte by Marx, Engels, and their followers. Section 2, The Positivistic Background of Marxian Philosophy. Section 3, The Elements of Positivist Philosophy in Engels. Part 2, The Foundations and Revisions of Dialectical Materialism. Chapter 5, The Foundations of Engels' Dialectical Materialism. 1, Genetic and Absolute Materialism. 2, The Criticism of Reductive Materialism and the Doctrine of Emergence. 3, The Doctrine of Dialectics. 4, The Doctrine of the Relativity of Knowledge. Chapter 6, Plekhanov's Revision of Dialectical Materialism. Section 1, The Rejection of Absolute Materialism. Section 2, The Two Basic Laws of Dialectics. Section 3, The Elimination of the Hegelian Triad and the Pervasive Power of Contradiction. Section 4, The Socio-Cosmic Roots of Dialectical Materialism. Chapter 7, The Dialectical Materialism of Lenin. Section 1, Epistemological Materialism. Section 2, The Reasons for the Adoption of Epistemological Materialism. Section 3, The Inadequacies of Epistemological Materialism. Section 4, The Principle of Partisanship and the Dogma of the Two Main Trends in Philosophy. Section 5, The Revision of the Laws of Dialectics. Section 6, A Comparison of Engels and Lenin's Dialectical Materialism. Section 7, Lenin's Political Atheism. Section 8, The Dialectical Justification of Cosmological Atheism. Chapter 8, Stalin's Socio-Cosmic Conception of the Universe. 1, Philosophical Materialism. 2, Dialectical Method. 3, Stalin as Philosopher. 4, The Voluntarism and Instrumentalism of Stalin. 5, The Equivocation of the Concept of Cause and the Abandonment of Voluntarism. 6, Voluntarism and the Sociomorphic Conception of the Universe. Part 3, The Connections between Dialectical Materialism and Historical Materialism. Chapter 9, Marx's Philosophy of History. Section 1, Two Formulations of Historical Materialism. 2, The Methodological Approach to the Problems of History. 3, Historical Materialism as a Historical Hypothesis. 4, Historical Materialism as a Philosophy of History. 5, The Problem of the Validation of Historical Materialism. Chapter 10, The Sociological Approach of Engels. Section 1, Engels' Contribution to the Materialistic Conception of History. Section 2, The Revision of Historical Materialism. Section 3, Engels' Views on the Validation of Historical Materialism. Section 4, The Relation of Historical to Dialectical Materialism. Chapter 11, Plekhanov's Unification of Dialectical and Historical Materialism. The Intellectual Background of the Marxian Theory. 2. Historical materialism as a substantive theory of history. Section 3. The role of dialectical materialism in the validation of historical materialism. Chapter 12. Historical materialism as a guide to action. Lenin's revision of Marxian determinism. The incontrovertible truth of historical materialism. The deduction of historical materialism from genetic materialism. 4. Stalin's codification of Leninist revisionism. 5. Two versions of historical materialism in Stalin. Chapter 8. The concept of scientific socialism. 1. The vicissitudes of the term. 2. The three connotations of the concept. 3. The naturalistic fallacy and the semantical confusion. 4. The reassertion of utopian socialism. And then there's conclusions. And all the other good stuff that comes with a book. On to the preface. It is not the purpose of this study to add another historical account of dialectical materialism to those already available in English and other European languages. Its main task is to trace the origin and development of dialectical materialism from dialectical materialism's inception to the present day and to examine critically a certain conception, or rather misconception, as this study intends to show, concerning its nature and content. This misconception was originated in the Soviet Union but has also been accepted by Western exponents of dialectical materialism, as well as by the majority of students of the, quote, Marxist theory, who concentrate their attention on its economic, social, and political aspects and are only marginally interested in philosophical foundations. The common misconception consists in considering dialectical materialism as a single, continuous, and uniform doctrine, conforming to one set of fundamental principles and methodological rules. It is supposed to be based upon the unvarying assumptions first formulated by Marx and Engels, the joint founders of the doctrine, which later were only explained, amplified, and defended by their followers. Quote, Marxism, end quote, is the name customarily given to the tradition of orthodoxy allegedly first established by Marx and Engels, preserved and protected from distortions by Plekhanov and Kautsky, and held to have been codified in its pristine purity by Lenin and Stalin. Quote, Marxism is not a name with proper credentials. It is an ambiguous term, having several closely related and interlocking meanings. It is also a vague term, since it is impossible to say which views is a vague term since it is impossible to say to which views it is applicable. Vagueness is different from ambiguity. Each meaning of an ambiguous expression may have a sharply defined extension, a set of objects which it denotes. When a term is vague, its field of application is blurred and undefined. But an expression may be both ambiguous and vague, and, quote, Marxism is an instance of this. What it is presumed to designate is merely a figment of the imagination, and what it does denote is a wide and vaguely circumscribed collection of views, often incompatible with each other. Quote, Marxism can be used to refer to practically anything you choose, and is thus a confusing or meaningless term. That dialectical materialism was formulated once and for all, in its final and perfect form by Marx and Engels, is an idea deeply embedded in Soviet philosophy. While Lenin and Stalin are duly credited with having enriched many parts of the, quote, Marxist theory, no such merits are ascribed to them in matters concerning dialectical materialism. They are praised only for having safeguarded the, quote, theoretical foundations of Marxism, end quote, that is, dialectical and historical materialism, from the motley crowd of revisionists, having restored the true doctrine of Marx and Engels and preserved it for posterity. Their reputation as theorists is based upon the fact that having mastered these, quote, theoretical foundations, they were able to apply the basic principles of dialectical materialism to the new problems arising in the, quote, epoch of imperialism and proletarian revolution, end quote, and advance the, quote, Marxist theory, end quote, in certain respects, such as the economic and social doctrines, the competition for world markets, class struggle, social construction, or the strategy and tactics of the proletariat. The Western exponents accept, implicitly or explicitly, the assumption of Soviet philosophy that dialectical materialism is a single doctrine, coherent and fixed in its content. Unlike Benedetto Croce and George Sorel, who emphasize the multiplicity of interpretations to which Marx's work lend themselves, they feel that it is right to recognize the existence of Marxism as a uniform philosophical tradition. If they discern any differences of opinion among its supporters, they regard these as unimportant and insubstantial. Consequently, what they examine as dialectical materialism is a synthetic creation of their own invention, compounded of the views of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin in various, more or less arbitrary combinations. The doctrine of dialectical materialism, constructed from fragments extracted from different authors, is supposed to reflect faithfully the original beliefs of those credited with its formulation, as well as the views of those classified as dialectical materialists in general. The assumption common to the Soviet and Western exponents of dialectical materialism is clearly untenable. First of all, the traditional and practically universally accepted view that Marx and Engels were the joint founders of dialectical materialism is not supported by the available evidence. It is to Engels alone that its authorship should be credited. This fact is recognized by some leading historians and analysts of dialectical materialism, for instance, J.M. Bachensky. Let's see if anything comes up for this person. I've never heard this name before. J.M. Bachensky. It says that Joseph Maria Bachensky lived from 1982 to 1995 and is a Polish Dominican logician and philosopher. He apparently wrote a book titled Der Sowjet-Russische Dialectischer Materialismus in 1950. Let me repeat that sentence. First of all, the traditional and practically universally accepted view that Marx and Engels were the joint founders of dialectical materialism is not supported by the available evidence. It is to Engels alone that its authorship should be credited. This fact is recognized by some leading historians and analysts of dialectical materialism, for instance, J.M. Bachensky, who, however, seems to ignore its implications. Furthermore, there are numerous and important differences between Engels on the one hand and Lenin and Stalin on the other in their respective interpretations of dialectical materialism, which consequently cannot be treated as a single doctrine. It is almost a commonplace to observe that to expound the views of an influential and controversial thinker is to develop them in some definite direction, and the views of Marx are no exception to this rule. For instance, Capital has been described at one time or another as an economic treatise, a critique of capitalism, a book of sociology and social history, or a study concerned with the philosophy of history. The difficulty of deciding the dispute among these incompatible claims is child's play compared with tracking down Marx's views concerning the nature of reality and the significant traits of the universe. To maintain, under these circumstances, that there is an apostolic succession, to use H.B. Aiton's expression, leading from Marx and Engels through Lenin and Stalin to some of their successors today, is to recognize certain political and ideological realities, not a distinctive trend of philosophical thought. I'm not seeing anything for H.B. Aiton. Moving on. Rather than being a fixed doctrine, dialectical materialism has varied in the form and content of its successive formulations, and it had its own history of development. To follow this process, to analyze the changes in the conceptual framework of dialectical materialism, and to inquire into the causes responsible for them is the main task of this study. Marx and Engels held an instrumentalist conception of knowledge. They valued theoretical thinking as a means of social reconstruction rather than for its consistency and truth. Their followers went even further and showed little inclination to theorize unless their inquiry had historical, social, or political significance. The quote Marxists, commented George Sorel, have indulged in so many plays of fantasy that serious people have been disinclined to consider their authoritative interpretations of Marx. What Sorel described as fantasy is the product of instrumental, goal-oriented, and ideological thinking decked out in theoretical terms. If the successful formulations of dialectical materialism from Engels to Stalin are carefully differentiated, it becomes possible to explain its changes and to discover the ideological roots and purposes of its revisions. This should become increasingly clear as the study proceeds and the thread of transformations is gradually unraveled. The synthetic doctrine of dialectical materialism, known from its Soviet and Western expositions, the doctrine compounded from the bits and pieces of different provinces, not only obliterates certain stages of its development, but also tends to underestimate the ideological significance of the whole construction or of the particular beliefs included in it. Moreover, The way in which the different elements of dialectical materialism are combined into a single whole is itself determined, at least in some cases and in some respects, by the ideological idiosyncrasy of the mind which makes the selection and carries out the construction. Everybody familiar with the works of Marx is probably aware of the fact that it is not always easy to understand him dispassionately. Much of what has been written about Marx reveals the writer's ideological or philosophical affiliation and the conformity to the laws of selective perception. These laws are operative in the reduction to a smallest common denominator of the views supposedly held by the dialectical materialist and in selection of the component parts regarded as essential for a complete statement of dialectical materialism. Finally, the analytic approach to dialectical materialism as opposed to the synthetic procedure followed by a logical analysis of historically ascertained facts enables us to deal effectively with certain stereotypes which are bound to accumulate when the views of a thinker or group of thinkers are much discussed, for one reason or another, for a long time, are more often reproduced from second-hand sources than studied in the original. There are many fixed views about Marx, which have been transformed into self-evident truths by frequent repetitions. These require re-examination and revision. The most baleful is the firmly held and long-established belief that the views of Marx and Engels are identical. To say that Marx and Engels had, as it were, a twin mind is to assume something extremely improbable and incompatible with the evidence available. The presupposition of identity is fateful for the interpretation of the philosophy of Marx, for the correct understanding of Engels' account of what Marx's and his own views were, and for the placing of the further stages of development of dialectical materialism in their proper perspective. According to another stereotype, Marx, quote, converted dialectical idealism into dialectical materialism, end quote. Or as it is more often put, the philosophy of Marx is Hegelianism inverted. The first of these interpretations is clearly unsound, for it presupposes what should first be proved, namely that Marx was a dialectical materialist in Engels' sense. Sorry, there's a storm happening, and I need to make sure rain is not coming in. There we are. Hopefully the rain cools this bitch down. It is hot. Alright. But also the second statement surprises rather than enlightens. One cannot really invert a philosophical doctrine. Therefore, to speak of the inversion of the Hegelian philosophy, allegedly accomplished by Marx, is to make use of a metaphor which no one up to now has tried to translate into plain language. The metaphoric description of the philosophy of Marx as Hegelianism inverted conceals more than it reveals, because it prevents us from discovering the distinctive characteristics of the Marxian view of the world. To give the final example, Marx is often described as a thinker who never emancipated himself from the influence of Hegel, while Engels is presented as an empirically minded philosophical writer, sympathetic to positivism and scientifically oriented philosophy. In fact, as the study will show on the basis of the re-examined source material, the two friends should be described exactly the other way around. Before proceeding in medias res and presenting in detail what the preface has touched upon, one more explanation is necessary. Dialectical materialism is usually understood to include a theory of knowledge, a methodology which embraces both logic and methodology of science, and a metaphysics, or rather a cosmology, for the metaphysics of materialism cannot really be differentiated from its cosmology. The present study deals with the second and third parts of dialectical materialism and leaves the first out of account. The theory of knowledge of dialectical materialism is Lenin's specific contribution to this doctrine. Moreover, it has exercised little if any influence upon the main body of beliefs of which it is supposed to be a part, being an adventitious appendage of a deductive metaphysics rather than its epistemological foundation. One second, sorry, the rain is still beating down. I think I have to close the window, which is unfortunate because it's got to steam up in here. So here, never mind. I've been trying to teach myself to not say such outrageous things all the time because nobody likes me. Moreover, it has exercised little, if any, influence upon the main body of beliefs of which it is supposed to be a part, being an adventitious appendage of a deductive metaphysics rather than its epistemological foundation. The inclusion of the theory of knowledge would extend the scope of this study without yielding any significant gains in the achievement of its main objective. What the author wished to say on this subject has been said elsewhere. Z. A. Jordan, University of Reading, March 1966. I'll read the acknowledgments since they're only a page long. Much of the work involved in writing this book was accomplished during the period of a fellowship awarded me from 1962 to 63 and the first half of 1963 to 4 by the Russian Institute, Columbia University. I am deeply grateful to the Institute for the leisure to study and write, and to its director and members for help and encouragement. My work on this book was greatly aided by the stimulating discussions which I have enjoyed during my stay at Columbia University. The first 6 sections of Chapter 7 were published in Slavic Review, Columbia University. I wish to thank its editor for his permission to make further use of this material in this book. Z. A. Jordan. The end. Thanks for listening.